It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Marcus Miller laughed as he poured his coffee over Sarah's shoes in front of the entire surgical staff. The dark, lukewarm liquid splashed across the pristine white leather of her nursing clogs, seeping into the mesh of her socks. The hospital cafeteria, usually a cacophony of clattering trays and hushed consultations, fell into a sudden vacuum-like silence. "Oops," Marcus said, his voice dripping with a mock sympathy that didn't reach his cold, arrogant eyes. He didn't pull back the cup until the very last drop had fallen. "I guess I didn't see you standing there, Sarah. Then again, people usually don't notice the help until they're underfoot." Sarah Miller didn't flinch. She felt the damp heat against her skin, a sharp contrast to the air-conditioned chill of the room. Her heart hammered a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs, not of fear, but of a cold, hardening resolve. She looked down at her ruined shoes, then up at her brother. He stood there in his perfectly tailored lab coat, the silver embroidery of his name catching the harsh, fluorescent light. He looked every bit the star neurosurgeon the hospital board adored, his Rolex glinting as he adjusted his silk tie. "You should be more careful, Marcus," she said, her voice low and remarkably steady. "Stains like that are hard to get out." "It's just a pair of cheap scrubs, Sarah," Jessica Miller chimed in, stepping up beside her husband. She leaned into him, her designer handbag draped over her arm like a trophy. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and disgust, the kind one might reserve for a stray dog. "Honestly, you look like you haven't slept in a week. Maybe if you'd listened to Linda and gone into interior design or something. Feminine. You wouldn't be standing here smelling like a burnt roast." Linda Miller, their mother, sat at a nearby table with a group of high society donors. She didn't stand up to defend her daughter. Instead, she offered a tight, embarrassed smile to her companions before looking at Sarah with a sharp, warning glare. "Sarah, dear, don't make a scene. Just go to the locker room and change. You're embarrassing your brother in front of his colleagues." The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in the room. Sarah saw Emma Miller, the youngest of the siblings, sitting at the edge of the crowd. Emma's eyes were wide, her knuckles white as she gripped her water bottle, but she remained silent. The hierarchy of the Miller family was absolute, and at the top sat Marcus, the golden son, the healer, the genius. Sarah was merely the nurse, the one who did the dirty work, the one who stayed late to hold the hands of the dying while Marcus signed autographs in the lobby. "I'm not the one making a scene, Mother," Sarah said, finally shifting her gaze to Linda. Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne, something woody and prohibitively priced, clashed with the sterile, metallic smell of the hospital. He leaned down, whispering so only she could hear. "Tonight is the big announcement dinner at the club. Robert is expecting a celebration. If you show up looking like a charity case, stay in the kitchen. I won't have you dragging down the family name while I'm being shortlisted for the chief of surgery position." He patted her shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove, and walked away. Jessica followed, her high heels clicking a rhythmic, dismissive staccato against the linoleum. The crowd began to disperse, the tension breaking into a low hum of gossip. Sarah stood alone for a moment, the coffee beginning to feel cold and sticky. She reached into the pocket of her scrub top and felt the hard edge of her phone. It buzzed. She pulled it out, shielding the screen from prying eyes. It was a private message from the hospital's chief executive officer. "The board has reached a unanimous decision. The contract is signed. Welcome to the executive team, Director Miller. We'll see you at the 2:00 p.m. emergency briefing. Don't mention this to the surgical staff yet. We want the surprise to be absolute." A secret power moment surged through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Marcus thought he was the king of this hospital, but he was about to find out that the help had just become his boss. She was no longer just the nurse who cleaned up his surgical messes. She was the director of patient safety and clinical oversight. Every one of his charts, every one of his miracle surgeries, and every one of his negligent shortcuts would now cross her desk for approval. She walked toward the staff locker room, each step leaving a faint, damp print on the floor. She didn't head for her locker, though. Instead, she walked to the administrative wing, her jaw set. She passed a mirror in the hallway and stopped. She looked at the stain on her chest, the tired lines around her eyes, and the simple ponytail she'd tied back at 5:00 a.m. "Wait for it," she whispered to her reflection. She reached into her locker and pulled out a garment bag she'd hidden there that morning. Inside was a charcoal gray power suit, tailored to perfection, and a pair of black pumps that cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment. She bought them with the signing bonus she hadn't told anyone about. She checked the time. Robert Miller, her father, would be at the club by 6, expecting to toast to Marcus's inevitable rise. He wouldn't even look at her when she walked in. He never did. To him, she was a disappointment, a girl who lacked the killer instinct required for the Miller legacy. Sarah felt the weight of the last 5 years, the missed holidays, the belittling comments at Sunday dinners, the way they'd all looked through her as if she were made of glass. She remembered the way Marcus had accidentally deleted her medical school applications years ago, forcing her into a nursing track so he wouldn't have to compete with her. She pulled the suit from the bag. The fabric was smooth, expensive, and carried the scent of fresh cedar. "You wanted a killer instinct, Dad," she murmured, her fingers tracing the sharp lapel of the jacket. "You're about to see one." She began to change, stripping away the stained scrubs and the identity they'd forced upon her. As she stepped into the pumps, the click of the heels on the tile sounded like a countdown. Marcus thought tonight was his coronation. He had no idea it was actually his trial. The phone buzzed again. It was a text from Emma. "Are you okay?" Marcus was being a jerk. "Are you coming to the dinner?" Sarah typed back a short, cryptic reply. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Emma. I have a big announcement of my own." She grabbed her leather briefcase and walked out of the locker room. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She looked like the woman who held Marcus's career in the palm of her hand. The hunt hadn't just begun. She had already won, and the best part was that Marcus was still laughing, completely unaware that the trap had already snapped shut. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling room swung open with a muffled thud, releasing a wave of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. Sarah Miller paused at the threshold, her fingers tightening momentarily on the handle of her leather briefcase. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus didn't feature prices, and the waiters moved like ghosts. In the center of the private alcove, her family sat gathered around a circular table draped in white linen that looked as stiff as their posture. Marcus Miller was already at the head of the table, his laughter booming over the soft clink of crystal. He looked every bit the golden boy in his tailored navy suit, a stark contrast to the man Sarah had seen sweating and panicked in the OR just hours before. Beside him, Jessica Miller was preening, her hand draped over his arm as she flashed a diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than a nurse's annual salary. "You're late," Linda Miller said, her voice cutting through the warmth of the room like a blade. She didn't look up from her wine glass. "We've already ordered the appetizers. I assume you had to take the bus. I told your father we should have sent an Uber for you, but Marcus said you'd probably prefer the exercise." "I drove myself, Mother," Sarah said, her voice level. She pulled out the empty chair between Emma and Robert Miller. As she sat, the silk of her new blouse felt cool against her skin, a tactile reminder of the shift in her world that none of them could see yet. Marcus smirked, leaning back as he swirled a dark amber liquid in his glass. "Drove? In that rusted-out sedan? I'm surprised the valet didn't point you toward the employee entrance. You're looking different, Sarah. Did you find a sale at the hospital gift shop? Or did you finally realize that scrubs aren't a personality trait?" Jessica giggled, the sound like breaking glass. "Be nice, Marcus. She's probably just trying to look respectable for your big night. It's not every day a Miller gets fast-tracked for chief of surgery." Sarah reached for her water glass, the cold condensation dampening her palm. She watched her brother across the table. The arrogance radiating off him was almost physical. He truly believed he was untouchable. He didn't know that the briefcase resting against Sarah's chair contained the preliminary audit of his last 6 months in the OR, a trail of minor errors that added up to a pattern of gross negligence. I heard about the incident today, Marcus, Sarah said quietly. The table went silent. Marcus's smirk flickered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pure contempt. The incident? You mean the routine complication I handled with my usual precision? If you spent less time eavesdropping on the surgeons and more time checking IV bags, you might actually be useful for once. Marcus is a hero, Linda snapped, finally looking at her daughter with eyes full of disappointment. The hospital is lucky to have him. Honestly, Sarah, your jealousy is becoming quite unbecoming. You should be celebrating your brother's success, not trying to drag him down to your level. Robert Miller cleared his throat, the sound of authority that usually ended all debates. Enough! Sarah, your brother has been invited to a private meeting with the Board of Trustees tomorrow morning. It's a formality before the official announcement. We are here to celebrate his elevation, not to discuss hospital gossip. Sarah felt a buzz in her pocket. She didn't have to look at the screen to know what it was. It was a confirmation from the hospital's legal department. As the newly appointed director of patient safety, she had been granted full access to the encrypted surgical logs Marcus thought he had deleted. The board meeting is at 9, right? Sarah asked, her voice impossibly calm. Marcus puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie. 10, not that it concerns you. You'll be busy changing bedpans while I'm being handed the keys to the department. In fact, I might make it my first order of business to have you transferred to the night shift in the basement. You seem to like the shadows so much. I wouldn't be so sure about the timing, Sarah replied, a small, sharp smile touching her lips. She looked at Emma, who was watching the exchange with wide, nervous eyes. Emma was the only one who didn't look at Sarah with disdain, but she was too afraid of Linda's shadow to speak up. And why is that? Marcus sneered, leaning forward until Sarah could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. Do you have a shift change you think I care about? Sarah stood up, the chair scraping softly against the mahogany floor. She didn't open the briefcase. Not yet. The face slap required the right audience, and the Miller family dinner was only the dress rehearsal. I just think tomorrow is going to be a very long day for you, Marcus, she said, picking up her bag. I have some preparation to do for a meeting of my own. Enjoy the steak. It might be the last thing the hospital pays for on your account. Where do you think you're going? Linda demanded, her face flushing with rage. Sit back down. You do not walk out on your brother's celebration. I'm not walking out on a celebration, Sarah said, her voice carrying to the neighboring tables as she turned toward the exit. I'm getting a head start on the paperwork for your replacement. She walked away, the rhythmic click of her heels sounding like a death knell. Behind her, Marcus's confused, angry shout echoed through the room, but she didn't look back. She had 12 hours until the board meeting, and Marcus Miller had no idea that he wasn't walking into a promotion. He was walking into a trap he had spent years building for himself. The hospital's administrative wing was a tomb of glass and steel at 2 in the morning. Sarah Miller walked the silent corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet she hadn't known existed until she received the keys to the director's suite. The air here smelled different, not of antiseptic and illness, but of expensive lemon wax and filtered oxygen. She swiped her new badge against the reader of the records room. The light blinked green with a satisfying click. Inside, the blue glow of a dozen monitors bathed the room in an eerie, underwater light. Sarah sat at the central terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wasn't just a nurse tonight. She was the ghost in the machine Marcus had spent years trying to ignore. She opened the surgical log archives. The paper trail wasn't made of paper anymore, but of digital breadcrumbs Marcus thought he'd swept away. She pulled up the records for the Kensington case, a routine gallbladder removal that had ended in a massive internal hemorrhage. Marcus had blamed the floor nurse for missing the vitals. He'd had her fired. Sarah felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her chest as she scrolled through the raw data. The timestamp on the cautery tool's usage didn't match Marcus's dictated report. He had nicked the hepatic artery, spent 20 minutes trying to fix it in secret, and then closed the patient while she was still oozing. The sound of her phone vibrating against the desk made her flinch. The caller ID displayed a name that made her stomach tighten. Linda Miller. Sarah answered, her voice a flat line. "It's late, Mom." "It's never too late to fix a disaster, Sarah." Linda's voice crackled with a sharp, frantic edge. "Your brother is humiliated. Jessica has been crying for an hour because you ruined the dinner. Do you have any idea how much that steak cost? How much that reservation meant to Marcus's reputation?" Sarah leaned back, watching the evidence of her brother's malpractice flicker on the screen. The reservation meant more than the truth, then. "The truth is that you're a jealous, bitter girl who can't stand to see her brother succeed," Linda snapped. The sound of Marcus's voice echoed in the background, muffled but dripping with his signature condescension. "Give me the phone, Mom. I'll handle the help." There was a scuffle, and then Marcus was on the line. "Listen to me, you pathetic little snitch. I don't know what kind of paperwork you think you're filing, but I've already spoken to the chief of staff. He's a friend of mine. We play golf every Sunday. By tomorrow afternoon, your license is going to be under review for harassment. You're done, Sarah. You're a nurse. I'm a surgeon. Do the math on who they're going to believe." Sarah looked at the file she had just unzipped. It contained a private recording from the operating room's integrated camera system. One Marcus didn't know had been upgraded to record audio during educational procedures. "I've done the math, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt colder than the air conditioning. "And it doesn't add up in your favor." "You're delusional," Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and jagged. "Go back to changing bedpans. It's the only thing you're qualified for. If you even show your face at the hospital tomorrow, I'll have security escort you out in handcuffs for trespassing. Mom and Dad are already drafting the paperwork to cut you out of the estate. You're nothing to this family now." He hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the low hum of the server cooling fans. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't feel the urge to scream. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling clarity. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. She began the transfer. Every altered log, every hidden complication, and the audio file where Marcus could clearly be heard telling a junior resident to delete that entry if you want to keep your residency, moved onto the drive. A shadow fell across the doorway. Sarah didn't turn around. She recognized the scent of peppermint and old books. "You're sure about this?" Emma Miller asked, stepping into the blue light. Her younger sister looked small in the vast office, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "If you do this, there's no going back. Mom and Dad, they'll never forgive you." Sarah watched the progress bar hit 90%. "They already haven't forgiven me for being the one who saw through him, Emma. I'm not doing this for revenge." She paused, her hand resting on the cool metal of the drive. "I'm doing it for the patients who didn't get to walk out of this hospital because my brother thought he was a god." Emma walked over, her gaze falling on the screen. She saw the names, the dates, and the blatant lies highlighted in red. He really did it, didn't he? He let them take the fall for his mistakes. "Every single time," Sarah said. She pulled the drive from the port. The weight of it in her palm felt like a weapon. She had 8 hours until the board meeting began. 8 hours until Marcus walked into the conference room expecting a coronation, only to find a gallows. "Go home, Emma," Sarah said, standing up. "Get some sleep. You're going to need your energy for tomorrow." "Why?" Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The hospital's logo glowed in red neon above them, casting a bloody hue over the parking lot where Marcus's luxury SUV sat in his reserved spot. "Because," Sarah said, her reflection in the glass looking like someone she barely recognized, someone powerful. "Tomorrow is the day the Miller family learns that the help is the one who signs the checks." She checked her watch. The countdown had begun. Marcus was likely at home, toasting his own brilliance with Jessica, blissfully unaware that the paper trail he'd left behind wasn't a path to a promotion, but a map leading straight to his professional execution. Sarah tucked the drive into her pocket and walked out, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing through the empty halls like a ticking clock. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Miller estate, catching the sharp edges of the crystal centerpiece on the mahogany dining table. The scent of expensive, over-roasted blue mountain coffee hung heavy in the air, a fragrance that usually signaled a morning of quiet luxury. Today, however, it felt like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Marcus Miller sat at the head of the table, his monogrammed surgical scrubs already donned, looking every bit the golden boy of the local medical scene. He didn't look up when Sarah Miller entered the room. Instead, he simply slid his empty porcelain cup toward the edge of the table without breaking his gaze from the stock market updates on his tablet. "Refill that, would you?" he muttered, his voice flat and expectant. "And tell the kitchen the eggs were slightly over-easy. I have a 3-hour bypass today. I need protein, not grease." Sarah stopped in her tracks. She felt the cold, heavy weight of the sterling silver spoon she had been about to pick up. She didn't move toward the coffee pot. Instead, she pulled out a chair and sat down directly across from him, a move so uncharacteristic of her usual morning routine that Marcus actually blinked, his eyes finally lifting from the screen. "I'm not the help, Marcus," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "And if you're worried about your performance in the OR today, perhaps you should spend less time worrying about your eggs and more time reviewing the post-operative infection rates on the 4th floor. Marcus let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He leaned back, the leather of the expensive chair creaking under his weight. "The 4th floor? Sarah, honey, I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I don't deal with the rates and audits you nurses obsess over. I save lives. The hospital administration handles the paperwork so I don't have to." The kitchen door swung open, and Jessica Miller breezed in, the rhythmic, sharp clack of her manicured nails against her phone screen filling the sudden silence. She was already dressed for a lunch date in a silk-wrap dress that cost more than Sarah's monthly mortgage payment. "Oh, good, you're both up," Jessica said, not looking at either of them. "Marcus, don't forget the board of directors gala is tomorrow night. I've already confirmed our table. And Sarah," she finally looked up, her eyes scanning Sarah's simple nursing scrubs with a flicker of pity, "I talked to the event coordinator. Since you'll be there anyway, I told her you wouldn't mind helping the caterers coordinate the staff meal in the back. It'll give you something to do so you don't feel so out of place among the donors." A second rage spike flared in Sarah's chest, hot and focused. She felt her phone buzz in her pocket, a notification from the hospital's internal server. Access granted. Director level. She didn't pull it out. She just looked at Jessica, then back at Marcus. "The gala," Sarah said, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, it's going to be a very illuminating evening for everyone. Marcus, I'm going to give you one piece of advice free of charge. Check the Svensson file. There's an inconsistency in the surgical log from last Tuesday. If you self-report it now, the disciplinary committee might be lenient." Marcus's face hardened, the smugness replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. The Svensson case was a success. The patient was discharged. If there's a typo in the log, some intern will fix it. Don't try to play doctor with me, Sarah. It's embarrassing. "I'm not playing," she replied softly. Linda Miller entered then, draped in a cashmere shawl despite the morning warmth. She made a beeline for Marcus, kissing his cheek before pointedly ignoring Sarah. "Robert is already at the club," she told her son. "He's playing 18 holes with the chief of staff. They're discussing your nomination for the Excellence in Medicine award tomorrow night. It's practically a done deal." Linda turned her gaze toward Sarah, her expression souring. "I hope you aren't filling his head with nonsense, Sarah. Marcus has enough stress without his sisters, safety concerns dragging him down. Be a dear and just stay out of the way for the next 24 hours. This is his moment." Sarah stood up, the legs of her chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetted blade. She looked at the three of them, the surgeon who thought he was a god, the wife who saw people as accessories, and the mother who had traded her daughter's worth for her son's ego. "You're right, Mother," Sarah said, picking up her bag. "It is a very big moment. Marcus, remember what I said about the Svensson file. Arrogance is a heavy coat to wear when the ice is thin." She walked out of the room before Marcus could respond, the silence she left behind thick with their collective disdain. As she reached her car, she pulled the flash drive from her pocket, the cold metal biting into her palm. She checked her watch. 28 hours until the gala. The Millers were so busy looking down at her that they hadn't noticed she was the one holding the ladder. And tomorrow, she was going to let go. The Starlight Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, designed specifically to make the wealthy feel significant and the significant feel like gods. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the ceiling, casting a fractured, shimmering light over 500 of the city's most influential medical professionals. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic undercurrent of sterilized ambition. Marcus Miller stood at the center of the room, his tuxedo tailored so precisely it looked like armor. He held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in a steady, frantic stream that mirrored his own soaring ego. To his left, Jessica Miller was a vision in shimmering silver sequins, her laughter ringing out like a practiced chime every time a senior board member made a mediocre joke. She adjusted the diamond necklace Marcus had bought her with a bonus he hadn't actually earned yet, her fingers tracing the stones with a possessive hunger. "It's a career-defining night, Marcus," Linda Miller whispered, leaning in to adjust his bow tie for the third time. She looked at her son with a devotion that bordered on the religious, her eyes sweeping over the room to ensure everyone was witnessing his radiance. "The way people are looking at you, they know. They all know who the real star of the surgical department is." Marcus smirked, the expression sharp and predatory. He caught his reflection in the polished marble of a nearby pillar and tightened his jaw. The Svensson file was the final nail, Mother. After tonight, the chief of surgery position isn't just a possibility, it's a formality. He glanced toward the entrance, his lip curling. "I just hope Sarah doesn't show up in her nursing clogs and ruin the aesthetic. I told her she could sit in the balcony with the junior staff, but she'll probably find a way to embarrass us anyway." Robert Miller nodded solemnly, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the room like a general. "Status is a delicate thing, Marcus. Don't let your sister's lack of ambition pull you down. Tonight is about the Miller legacy." Emma Miller stood a few feet away, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her dress. She looked between her brother's radiating arrogance and the expectant faces of the board members. She had seen the way Sarah had looked at the dinner table the night before, that terrifying, quiet calm. It made the hair on the back of Emma's neck stand up. "Maybe we should just focus on the dinner," she muttered, but her voice was swallowed by the swell of the string quartet. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The room didn't go silent immediately, but a ripple of curiosity began to spread from the entrance like a stone dropped into a still pond. Sarah Miller didn't walk into the room. She occupied it. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight navy silk that moved like liquid shadow. There were no sequins, no flashy diamonds, only a single vintage sapphire pendant that glowed with a cold, inner fire against her skin. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated knot, revealing a face that was no longer tired or deferential. It was the face of a woman who had spent years watching her enemies from the tall grass, and she was finally stepping into the clearing. She didn't head for the balcony. She walked straight toward the VIP tables at the front of the stage. Marcus felt a surge of heat crawl up his neck. He set his champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp asterisk clink. "What is she doing?" he hissed to Jessica. "She's heading for the chairman's table." "She's going to make a scene," Jessica whispered, her face tightening with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Marcus, stop her before she says something to Dr. Aris." Marcus intercepted Sarah just as she reached the edge of the dance floor. He stepped into her path, using his height to try and dwarf her, but she didn't flinch. Up close, he could smell the faint, crisp scent of ozone and expensive paper clinging to her, not the floral perfumes of the other women. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've had your little dress-up moment. Now turn around and find the staff seating before you make a fool of yourself. This table is for people who actually contribute to the hospital's prestige. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt a flicker of genuine unease. Her eyes weren't angry. They were pitying. She reached out and brushed an invisible speck of dust from his lapel, her touch as light as a scalpel's edge. "You've always been so obsessed with the view from the top, Marcus," she said, her voice calm and perfectly modulated for the acoustic space. "But you never learned how to check the foundation. Arrogance has made you blind." "I'm the one on the program, Sarah," he snapped, leaning closer so only she could hear. "I'm the one they're honoring tonight for the Svensson recovery. You're just a nurse who got lucky with a shift change. Go hide in the shadows where you belong." "The program hasn't started yet," Sarah replied. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a cold breeze against his ear. "And the shadows are where the most interesting truths are found. Enjoy the spotlight while it's still on you, brother. It's about to get very bright in here." She stepped around him with a grace that left him staring, paralyzed by a sudden, inexplicable sense of vertigo. He watched as she approached Dr. Aris, the chairman of the board. Marcus expected the older man to look confused, to call security, or to dismiss her with a polite nod. Instead, Dr. Aris stood up. He took Sarah's hand and leaned in, speaking to her with a level of deference he usually reserved for billionaire donors. He gestured to the empty chair directly to his right, the seat Marcus had assumed was reserved for the incoming chief of surgery. Sarah sat down. She didn't look back at the Miller family. She opened her small, silver clutch and adjusted something inside, a small, metallic flash drive that caught the light of the chandeliers. "Marcus." Linda's voice was high and tight. She had moved to her son's side, her hand gripping his arm so hard her knuckles were white. "Why is she sitting there? That's your seat. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Robert said, his voice sounding hollow. He was watching the way the other board members were interacting with Sarah. They weren't treating her like a guest. They were treating her like the person in charge of the room. The lights in the ballroom dimmed and a single spotlight hit the podium. The chatter died down to a low hum of anticipation. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He straightened his jacket, trying to reclaim his composure. "It doesn't matter where she sits," he told himself. "The records are in my name. The success is mine. She's just playing a game." Dr. Aris stepped up to the microphone, his shadow stretching long and dark across the stage. He looked out over the crowd, his expression unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aris began, his voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight we celebrate excellence. We celebrate the breakthroughs that define our institution. But more importantly, we celebrate the integrity that protects our patients when the system fails." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the table where Sarah sat. She remained perfectly still, a statue of midnight silk. "Before we present the Surgical Achievement Award," Aris continued, "we have a special presentation. A revelation regarding the Svensson case that will change the way we look at leadership in this hospital forever." Marcus felt the floor beneath him turn to thin ice. He looked at Sarah, and in the dim light, he saw her tilt her head just a fraction of an inch. She didn't smile. She simply waited. "I'd like to invite our Director of Patient Safety to the stage," Aris said. Marcus started to take a step forward, his hand going to his tie, his mind ready to bridge the gap between the special presentation and his own glory. But the chairman wasn't looking at him. The spotlight shifted. It moved away from Marcus, leaving him in the cold dark of the floor, and swept across the room until it landed on Sarah. She stood up, the sapphire at her throat gleaming like a warning light. As she began the walk toward the stage, the silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound of a falling empire. The rhythmic click of Sarah's heels against the polished hardwood stage was the only sound in the cavernous ballroom. The sapphire at her throat caught the overhead lights, throwing jagged blue sparks across the front row where her family sat frozen. Marcus stood just outside the circle of the spotlight, his hand still hovering near his silk tie, his face caught in a grotesque mask of confusion. He looked like a man who had walked into a glass door he hadn't realized was there. Sarah reached the mahogany podium and adjusted the microphone. The slight hum of the speakers vibrated through the room, a low-frequency warning. She didn't look at the crowd yet. She looked at the man who had spent a lifetime treating her like a footnote in his own grand biography. "Thank you, Chairman," she said, her voice amplified, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "As the Director of Patient Safety, my mandate is simple. The truth survives even when people try to bury it under titles and tenure." A murmur rippled through the audience. Marcus took a half-step toward the stage, his face beginning to flush a deep, angry purple. "Sarah, what is this?" he hissed, low enough that only the front rows could hear, but the microphone caught the edge of his desperation. "Get down from there. You're making a scene." She didn't even blink. She clicked a small remote in her hand. Behind her, a massive projection screen descended, white and blinding. A second later, it was filled with the digitized files of the Svensson case. There was the surgical log, the anesthesia records, and most importantly, the internal incident report that had been scrubbed from the hospital's main server 3 months ago. "The Svensson case wasn't a tragic complication," Sarah told the room, her gaze finally sweeping over the board members. "It was a systemic failure of ego." A lead surgeon ignored 3 separate warnings from the nursing staff that the patient's vitals were trending toward sepsis. He chose to finish his golf handicap conversation rather than return to the OR. She clicked the remote again. A zoomed-in image of a signature appeared. It was Marcus Miller's flamboyant, arrogant scrawl, dated 2 hours after the patient had already coded, backdating a physical exam that never happened. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that preceded a landslide. Marcus's face underwent a violent transformation. The smug, ruddy glow of champagne-fueled arrogance drained away, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that made him look a decade older in seconds. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch. His eyes, usually sharp with condescension, bulged behind his expensive glasses, darting frantically toward the exit as if searching for a hole to crawl into. Sweat broke out across his brow, matting his perfectly styled hair, and his chest heaved in shallow, jagged gasps that rattled in the sudden silence of the ballroom. He looked small. For the first time in his life, he looked exactly as he was, a fraud caught in the light. In the front row, the family was a study in collapse. Linda Miller had her hand pressed so hard against her mouth that her knuckles were white, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and social calculation. Robert Miller sat like a statue carved from granite, his eyes fixed on the screen, his mouth a thin, hard line of realization. Beside them, Jessica Miller didn't look at her husband. She was looking at the board members, her eyes narrowed, already mentally distancing herself from the wreckage of Marcus's career. Only Emma Miller looked at Sarah, her expression one of dawning, whispered pride. "This report," Sarah continued, her voice dropping an octave, "was suppressed. But as director, I have full oversight of the safety archives. This is the unedited version." Aris, the chairman, stood up from his seat. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked only at Sarah. "And the recommendation of your department, Director Miller. Immediate suspension of surgical privileges pending a full board review for gross negligence and falsification of medical records," Sarah said. She finally turned her head to look directly at her brother. The spotlight reflected in her eyes, making them look like cold flint. "You told me once that I didn't belong in the same room as people of your status, Marcus. You were right. I don't belong in the audience. I belong in the seat that decides if you ever hold a scalpel again." Marcus tried to speak. A pathetic, wet sound escaped his throat, but no words followed. He looked at his father, pleading, but Robert Miller turned his head away, unable to meet his son's gaze. The board members at the surrounding tables began to shift their chairs, a collective physical withdrawal. They were already treating him like a ghost. Sarah didn't wait for the applause or the shouting that she knew was coming. She gathered her tablet, stepped down from the podium, and walked off the stage. She passed Marcus without a single glance, the scent of her perfume, something crisp and sharp, lingering in the air he was struggling to breathe. She reached the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and pushed them open, stepping out into the quiet, cool air of the hallway. Behind her, the room erupted into chaos, but she didn't look back. She had a phone call to make to the medical board, and for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. The silence of the hallway was a physical weight, broken only by the muffled chaos erupting behind the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. Sarah Miller leaned against the cold wainscoting, her breath hitching as the adrenaline began its slow, jagged retreat. She pulled her phone from her clutch, the screen's glow illuminating the pale, steady set of her features. She didn't have to wait long. The doors burst open with a violent crash, and Marcus Miller stumbled out, his tuxedo jacket disheveled and his face a mask of frantic, sweating rage. He lunged toward her, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the polished marble. He stopped just inches away, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and sour desperation. "You think you've won," he hissed, his voice cracking with a tremor he couldn't hide. "You think some little slideshow is going to erase 10 years of my surgical record? I am the golden boy of this hospital. You're a nurse, Sarah, a glorified pill pusher who got lucky with a promotion." Sarah didn't flinch. She felt the cold vibration of her phone in her hand, a call already in progress. "I'm the director of patient safety, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a level of calm that seemed to infuriate him more than a scream would have. "And those records I showed weren't just slides. They were the original, unedited logs from the surgical robotics suite, the ones you thought you deleted." He stepped closer, invading her space, his shadow looming large against the flickering wall sconces. "I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll make sure you never work in a clinic again. I'll tell Dad you forged them. He'll believe me. He always believes me." He reached out, his hand gripping her upper arm with a bruising force. "Retract it. Go back in there right now and tell them it was a mistake, or I swear to God I will ruin you." This was the rage spike she had expected. The entitled bully backed into a corner, reaching for the only weapon he knew, intimidation. But Sarah just looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up into his bloodshot eyes. "The medical board is on the line, Marcus. They've been listening for the last 3 minutes." He froze, his fingers twitching as he released her arm as if it had turned to white-hot iron. At that moment, the rest of the family spilled out of the ballroom. Robert Miller led the way, his face a stony mask of repressed fury, followed by a sobbing Linda Miller and a pale, wide-eyed Emma Miller. Bringing up the rear was Jessica Miller, who wasn't crying. She was looking at her husband as if he were a stain she couldn't wait to bleach out of her life. "Robert, tell her." Marcus shouted, spinning toward his father. "Tell her she's lying. It's a setup. She's jealous because I'm the surgeon and she's—" "Quiet," Robert said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through Marcus's hysteria like a scalpel. The patriarch stood under the harsh light of the chandelier, the scent of expensive cigars and old money clinging to him. He looked at his son, and for the first time in 30 years, there was no pride in his gaze, only a cold, clinical disgust. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out from behind the family. It was Dr. Aris, the representative from the state medical board, whom Sarah had invited as her +1 under a pseudonym. He stepped forward, holding a digital tablet that mirrored the evidence Sarah had just presented. The moment of the face slap arrived, though no hand was raised. As Dr. Aris began to speak, Marcus's face didn't just pale. It seemed to physically deflate, the arrogance draining out of his features to reveal a hollow, terrified shell. His eyes, once sharp with condescension, bulged behind his eyelids as they darted frantically, seeking an escape that didn't exist. A sickly, grayish hue crept from his neck to his cheeks, and a frantic twitch developed in his left eyelid, rhythmically pulsing against his skin. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a wet, silent vibration, unable to form the lies that had always come so easily to him before. He looked smaller, the expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "Dr. Miller," Aris said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Based on the metadata provided and the corroborating evidence of surgical tampering, Your license is hereby suspended pending a full criminal investigation into patient endangerment. Security is waiting at the main entrance to escort you from the premises." The silence that followed was absolute. Linda let out a strangled gasp, clutching her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. Emma stepped back, her hand over her mouth, looking at her brother as if he were a stranger. But it was Jessica who delivered the final blow. She walked up to Marcus, who was leaning against a decorative pillar for support. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't even offer a look of pity. "My father's lawyers will be calling your father's lawyers by morning, Marcus," Jessica said, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "I didn't marry a fraud, and I certainly won't stay married to a felon. Don't bother coming back to the penthouse. The locks are being changed as we speak." She turned on her heel, the rhythmic click-clack of her designer stilettos echoing through the hall like a countdown reaching 0. She didn't look back. Robert Miller looked at Sarah. He didn't apologize. He wasn't a man who knew how, but he gave a single, stiff nod of acknowledgement. It was the first time he had ever truly seen her. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving Linda to scurry after him, her frantic whispers fading into the distance. Emma lingered for a second, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a mixture of awe and fear, before she too disappeared into the shadows of the ballroom. Marcus was left alone in the center of the hall, the light from the chandelier mocking him. He looked at Sarah, his mouth working silently, a pathetic, broken sound finally escaping his throat. Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag, her expression unreadable. She had spent a lifetime in this man's shadow, accepting his crumbs of affection and his mountains of abuse. She felt a strange, cold peace settling over her, the weight of the Miller name finally sliding off her shoulders. "You said I didn't belong in your world, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. "You were right, I don't. Because in my world we actually save people. In yours you only save yourself, and it looks like you failed at that too." She turned and walked toward the exit, the scent of fresh rain and freedom waiting for her beyond the glass doors. She didn't stop to watch him fall. She didn't need to. The sound of his knees hitting the marble floor was all the closure she required. 6 months had passed since the heavy glass doors of the Miller Surgical Center had closed behind Sarah Miller for the last time. In that half-year, the world had shifted on its axis, tilting away from the gilded arrogance of the Miller name and toward a quiet, clinical justice that Sarah had spent a lifetime building. The new office on the top floor of University General smelled of cedar and fresh ink, a sharp contrast to the cloying, heavy lilies Marcus always insisted on in his private suites. Sarah sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, her fingers tracing the cool, heavy barrel of a silver fountain pen, a gift from the board of directors when they appointed her the youngest director of patient safety in the state. It was a weight she had earned, not inherited. The phone on her desk buzzed. She didn't need to look at the caller ID to know it was Linda Miller. Her mother had called every Tuesday for 3 months, a rhythmic, desperate attempt to perform a surgical repair on a family that had already bled out. "Sarah, please," Linda's voice crackled through the speaker, thin and brittle. "Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. Robert won't even go to the club anymore. He says the whispers are louder than the television. And Marcus. Sarah, he's living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the city. A rental. Jessica left him 3 weeks after the medical board suspended his license. She took the house in the Hamptons, Sarah. Everything." Sarah felt a flicker of the old protective instinct, but it died as quickly as a spent match. She remembered the wine stain on her dress, the way Linda had looked away while Marcus laughed at her. "He's working as a consultant for insurance claims, Sarah," Linda continued, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "He's a paper pusher. He's a Miller. You have the power to talk to the board. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them the data was flawed." "The data wasn't flawed, Mother," Sarah said, her voice like a calm, steady heartbeat. "The patients were real. The mistakes were real. I didn't destroy Marcus's career. I just stopped being the person who cleaned up the blood after he walked out of the room." "You're so cold," Linda hissed, the mask of maternal concern finally slipping to reveal the entitled rage beneath. "After everything we gave you, You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching your own brother rot in a cubicle while you sit in that ivory tower. I'm not enjoying it, Sarah replied, standing to look out at the city skyline. But for the first time in my life, I'm not responsible for it. Goodbye, Mother. She ended the call and felt the silence of the room wrap around her like a shield. Across town, in a cramped apartment where the radiator rattled with a rhythmic, metallic cough, Marcus Miller sat at a laminate kitchen table. The air smelled of stale coffee and the cheap, lemon-scented floor cleaner he'd had to learn to use himself. His hands, once touted as the most expensive instruments in the hospital, were now stained with the blue ink of a Bic pen. He looked at the stack of insurance files piled high in front of him. Each one was a denial form, a tedious exercise in bureaucracy that he would have mocked 6 months ago. Now, he was the one checking boxes. He reached for his phone, habitually checking his reflection in the dark screen. The man staring back looked hollowed out. The expensive haircuts were gone, replaced by a jagged, home-trimmed mess. His silk ties had been sold to pay the retainer for a lawyer who had ultimately told him he was indefensible. He had tried to call Jessica Miller a dozen times, but she had changed her number and moved into a condo paid for by the divorce settlement she'd secured before his assets were frozen. She hadn't even left a note. She had simply waited until he was at his first hearing and emptied the safe. A knock at his door made his heart skip. For a second, he thought it might be Sarah, coming to offer him a way back. Or Robert, finally deciding that the family name was worth more than the truth. He opened the door to find Emma Miller standing there. She wasn't wearing the designer labels their parents had always bought for her. She was in a simple nursing scrub top, her eyes tired but clear. "Are you here to gloat too?" Marcus snapped, his voice cracking with a bitterness that tasted like copper. Emma didn't flinch. She looked past him into the messy, dim apartment. "I'm here to bring you the rest of your things from the house. Dad's selling the estate, Marcus. He's downsizing. He says he can't afford the taxes now that the center's malpractice insurance has tripled." Marcus felt the floor tilt. "Selling the house, that's my inheritance." "There is no inheritance," Emma said quietly. "There's only the debt of what you did. Sarah's the only one of us who actually has a career left. The rest of us are just Millers, and it turns out that doesn't mean what we thought it did." She handed him a small box of personal items and turned to leave. "Wait," Marcus called out, a desperate, pathetic edge to his voice. "Does she ever ask about me, Sarah?" Emma paused, her hand on the hallway railing. "No, Marcus, she doesn't. She's too busy saving the people you forgot were human." Back in her office, Sarah opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was a framed photograph from a decade ago, a Miller family portrait. Robert and Linda sat in the center, Marcus standing proudly behind them, his hand on Robert's shoulder. Sarah was off to the far right, partially obscured by the shadow of a heavy velvet curtain, her face a blur of compliance and quiet misery. She looked at the girl in the shadows and felt a profound, aching pity. The cost of her victory was total. She was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a Miller in the way they defined it. She was an island. She took a small pair of surgical scissors from her desk. With a steady hand, she cut herself out of the frame. She left the rest of the Millers behind in the drawer and placed the small, jagged cutout of herself on her new desk, propped up against the silver pen. She was alone, but for the first time in 30 years, she was finally visible.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.